If your students are struggling to revise effectively, this podcast episode is for you. Today, I'm going to walk you through how to structure a revision using the science of memory. And as a science teacher, I obviously love this. We're going to be looking at interleaving, the forgetting curve, so students actually remember what they study, and spaced repetition. And the best part, this is all about working smarter and not harder, which your students are going to love hearing. Plus, I've got a free guide that you can give straight to your students to help them plan their revision with strategies backed by neuroscience. Welcome back to Miss Estruch Teach and Tell, the podcast designed to help teachers streamline their workload and improve student learning. I'm your host, Katie Estruch, and today's episode is a must for any teacher who has ever heard a student say, I revised so much, but I still don't remember anything in the exam and I didn't get the marks, which I'm guessing we have all heard multiple times. Hey there teachers, welcome to Miss Estruch Teach and Tell, the podcast where every week I dive into all the tips and tricks that make teaching life so much easier. Whether you're a veteran educator, an early career teacher learning the ropes, or balancing the classroom with being a busy parent, this will help you streamline your workload and bring a bit more balance to your life. You bring the coffee and I'll bring the teach and tell. I'm going to be breaking down with you two really powerful revision techniques, which are interleaving and spaced repetition, which have been proved by neuroscientists to dramatically increase long-term retention and therefore exam performance. And because we all know students are resistant to the extra effort, I'll be showing you how to sell these techniques to your students as hacks that save them time and make revision easier and therefore getting them more marks with very little extra effort. But first, the quick coffee catch up. This week, I've been focusing like everything on revision. It's been revision mode for me because I'm running my free webinars for A-level students, and I've been doing them on Monday, and I did one yesterday, which was Monday. I've got one today and I've got one tomorrow, and I had about 800 students turn up to yesterday's. So let's see how tomorrow's goes and the one after. So all about revision. I was talking about revision mistakes, identifying your weaknesses, setting smart targets. So my head is full in revision mode, which takes me nicely onto the main content. We're talking about how we can get students to plan smarter revision, not just thinking the only way to improve is to do more hours of revision. So let's start by looking at the forgetting curve and why students might be forgetting everything they revise. Now, you may well be familiar with the forgetting curve. Your students might be if they take psychology as well, but most students have not come across this concept before. And one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen students make is thinking that if they've revised something once or twice, or they revised for a test once, they then expect that they should be able to remember everything forever. But that's not how memory works. So what does the science say, and what could you tell your students to help them better understand how their brain actually works? And if they're taking biology, they're probably going to be interested in this science of how their brain actually helps them to remember everything. So I would actually show them Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, the German psychologist who discovered that we forget about 50% of what we have learned within an hour. So when you have your lesson, an hour later, you've probably forgotten 50% of what you were just told in that hour. And then after 24 hours, you've forgot 70%. And then after a week, you've forgotten about 90% of what you were taught in that lesson. Unless you actively revisit that information so that you then rebuild that memory. And that is the forgetting curve, which if you watch on YouTube, I've got it up now, and I do recommend you actually show this to your students. So there's different ways you could explain this to your students. You could literally just explain it like that, or you can have an analogy. So you could tell your students, imagine you're hearing a song once. Will you be able to sing the lyrics to that song a week later? No. If you've only ever heard it once, a week later, you're not going to remember the lyrics. But if you listen to that song repeatedly, let's say 5 times spread out over that week, you probably would remember most of the lyrics without much effort. And revision works the same way. If you review a topic 5 times is the golden number, then your brain will lock in that information so that you will then have this long-term retention, which will better help you for the exam. So how to use that then in revision? You could tell them that instead of revising a topic once and ticking it off on your revision list that you have covered the content, it's a phrase I hear all the time, you should actually be planning doing 5 short reviews of each topic spread out between now and your exams. And sometimes that does actually overwhelm the students, and they think, how on earth am I going to revise every topic 5 times for biology plus my other A levels? So I do actually point out it's 5 revisits, but that is from the first time you learnt it. So if you did a homework task after you learnt it in the lesson, that's 1 revisit. If you had to revise for an end of topic test, that's another. If you revise for a mock, that's another. So it's not literally 5 from now, but the key thing is showing them this graph and that this is how quickly, on average, the brain forgets information. But if you revisit something, and the key is leaving a gap, revisit it maybe a few days later, a week later, your memory goes up and the amount you forget reduces every time. So it's helping them to schedule their revision, bearing that in mind. And that leads me into spaced repetition, which uses this concept of the forgetting curve to really help revision stick. And lots of students, as I just said, tend to do all their revision for one topic in one go, so they can tick it off that I've covered biological molecules. And that is known as blocked revision. And whilst it might feel really satisfying for them and productive that they are ticking off all this content and that is now done, the reality is it's not done. It's going to fade from their memory really quickly, and then when they do their mock or their test, they're surprised that they couldn't remember it or they didn't do very well. So it's not necessarily students aren't working hard or putting in the hours, they're just not scheduling their revision in an effective way. So studies have shown that spaced repetition, using that knowledge of the forgetting curve, where you revise a topic multiple times over several weeks, is up to 300 times more effective than cramming that same amount of information in one day or a short period of time. So how to sell this to the students, particularly if they're students that are hardworking, then you're not doing any extra, it's just how you are scheduling this revision. And again, if your students like an analogy to help them to remember this concept, you could go for the concept of, it's like painting your nails. If you had 1 coat of nail varnish, that's going to wear off pretty quickly. If you add multiple layers and leave time in between each time for it to dry and then add another layer, the nail varnish is going to last much longer. And your brain is the same way. If you revise something and then leave a bit of time, revise it again, leave a bit of time, revise it again, that really helps it stick. And in terms of the actual biology, if they are interested, it's all to do with neurons. The more times you are thinking about and actively testing, can you remember it, you're strengthening that neural pathway. And if you do that at least 5 times, you then have a really strong neural pathway, and it's basically long-term memory. If you only revise it once though, your brain will deem this as not useful information, because that's to prioritize those neural pathways, and therefore it'll break that neural pathway and use it for something else that you have been thinking about more. And I actually love linking this to, if you've seen Inside Out, which is, I love that film, but in Inside Out, that's exactly the concept that they're using when they have those memory balls, and you see those like caretakers in the brain, they get rid of all the balls that are grey because that means they haven't been used recently, those memories haven't been activated recently, so they get rid of those balls so they can be reused for newer memories. And that's what's happening in reality. Your neural pathways, if you're not using them, your brain will then use that neural pathway for something else. So how to then use this to inform their revision? But instead of cramming one topic or block revising one topic, recommend instead that maybe they do shorter periods of time. So maybe revise for 30 or 45 minutes for one particular subject, then they move on to a different one, but then they can come back to that one for another 30 minutes, either at the end of that week or the next week after. So they're still doing the same amount of revision, but they're doing smaller chunks spread out repeatedly. And this actually goes hand in hand with the final thing, which is interleaving their revision, which you can sell as a hack to them as improving their application ability just by changing when they are revising content. So it's really common that most students will revise by spending an entire study session just on one topic. So we've talked about this idea of block revision, doing all of one topic, tick off, I've done it, then move on to the next one. But research does show that this is not the most effective way to revise. So what the science actually tells us is interleaving is effective. And this is when, instead of just block revising one topic, you revise a little bit of that topic, and then you revise a little bit of another one, and then you revise a bit of another one, and then you interleave and you go back to the original topic. So it's like alternating when you're revising everything. So you're not doing a block to tick off biological molecules, you're doing a little bit of it, then a little bit of cells, then a little bit of immunity, then you go back to the next little bit of cells, and so on. And this is helpful because it forces the brain to work harder and make it recognize patterns more easily. And studies have shown that students who interleave their revision, this is quite a big variation here, but they score between 25 and 76% higher in their exams. Now, obviously, that could be because the type of student who follows this advice is the type of student who would perform better anyway, but there is evidence that it shows that in particular, students who do interleaved revision score higher on application questions. And again, yes, that could be because of other variables, but the thought process is that if you are revising in little sections instead of blocks, the brain is better able to make connections between the topic and see how everything links together holistically. And if the student is thinking more holistically about biology rather than topics on a spec, when it comes to these application questions, they're more able to see the connections and think, well, maybe it links to proteins here and the enzymes and then also tertiary structure, and they can see these connections more easily. Now, if we need to have an analogy for this to sell it to the students, we could link it to working out at the gym. So if someone was going to do, let's say, 50 bicep curls in one go, your muscles are going to get tired and stop improving because there's a maximum amount of bicep curls you can do before your muscles fatigue. But if you mix up the exercises and you did some bicep curls, then some squats, then some press-ups, your body's actually going to adapt faster overall because you're using different parts of the body and they'll all increase in strength. And your brain is working in the same way. Switching between those topics makes your memory stronger overall and better able to connect between those different concepts. So how they can then implement this into their revision, instead of saying, I'm going to do 3 hours of biology revision, they could actually say, I'm going to do 1 hour of biology, 1 hour of, let's say they do chemistry, 1 hour of maths, if those are their 3 A levels. But also within their biology hour, they could say, I'm going to do half an hour on gene technologies, half an hour on meiosis. So actually interleaving what they do. They could mix the type of questions as well. So it could be interleaved skills. So they could do some multiple choice questions. It could be they're going to do some essay plans, some maths questions, summary notes. And then the other thing is deliberately switching between the topics, as I've said. But they need to make sure that they are still revisiting those topics 5 times. Now, this is a lot of information for students to get their head around of. They might be really on board straight away, like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. You do forget things, so I have to revise it multiple times and leave a gap in between. And if I interleave it, that makes sense as well. But how on earth do I plan this? That is so much for me to get my head around. And that takes me to my quick win of the week of 2 resources that I have created. I originally made them for my students at school, but now I sell them online because I wanted to implement this idea of spaced repetition and interleaving and create the plan for them to save them that headache. So I have got a study tracker, which I've got for at least 5 different exam boards for A level, where I've got all of the spec points, and then there's 5 columns, and students have a drop down menu to say what activity they've done, and it tracks, or they manually track, when they've revised each thing, so they can see have they done it 5 times, and then a little percentage pops up to show them what percentage they're through of their revision. So that's to help encourage this idea of spaced repetition, the forgetting curve, make sure you do it at least 5 times, and because there's the drop down menu of revision activities they could do, it's giving them suggestions of effective revision strategies. So that's available on my website that you can advertise to your students as a way that they could do this. Or if you were interested in getting a school license, then just email me, missestruch@gmail.com, and then I can give you a school license so you can then just share it with all of your students. Linked to that, I do also have a long-term revision planner, which I think is 99p. It's just an Excel spreadsheet for students to use. And it says, it does start in March though, so it might need to be tweaked if you're only watching this now in April. It tells them what to revise every single week. So I've worked out the 5 repetitions and the interleaving, and I've based it on what I think students have learned at different points of the year. But I do have a recommendation with that they might want to tweak it because everyone is different, and what you find harder, you should maybe start with and make sure you definitely cover multiple times. So there's those 2 resources that you could recommend to your students to tick off interleaving plan and the spaced repetition plan to save them the headache of doing it. Or maybe you'd like to have a copy so you can work out how to recommend it to your students. Right, resource roundup of the week. This week's freebie is the free guide that you can give to your students. So if you don't want to give them those study trackers, you can instead give them this free guide to help them know how to plan their revision. So I've put together this student-friendly guide. It gives them a bit of information on the forgetting curve, therefore why we should be revisiting topics 5 times. Also that concept of interleaving and how to mix it all in to boost your memory and your application skills with a step-by-step plan. So this is to go directly to the students, but it might help you as well if you're planning a revision lesson and you want to explain some of these concepts to them. So I'll put that in the description description so you can get hold of a copy. But that is it for today. I hope this has given you some ideas of how you can actively teach your students to better plan their revision, whether that is as a form tutor, whether it is as part of your revision lessons or interventions. Hopefully you can find a way that you can use this to support your students. And if you have found it helpful, then I would love it if you could leave a comment or a review to help boost the profile of this podcast so that you're supporting me, but also that means I'm able to support even more teachers, streamlining their workload and coming up with ideas to better help their students. But that is it for this week. Hopefully I'll see you next week. You bring the coffee and I'll bring the teach and tell.